Good evening. You're watching The Digital Age, and I'm James Goodale. You know, one of the great surprises of the Bush-Kerry election was the huge margin by which Bush won the election. You remember the newspapers the day before said, race too tight to call, so I think everybody was looking for a really tight race the way it was 4 years before, but all of a sudden Bush won by this huge margin. And why? So I thought it'd be fun tonight to find out you know, why did Bush win? How did he win by so much? And also, there's an internet connection here, and that is, did Kerry lose it on the net? Well, joining us tonight to discuss these absolutely provocative questions is Beth Noveck, who is at New York Law School, where she teaches intellectual property, and if I may say so, technological law. The law of technology is not exactly what you teach, but close enough for our audience. And Victor Kovner, our friend, I don't want to say our old friend, our friend of many years, who's back tonight, has a long role in the Democratic Party, has been a delegate to many conventions, and ran the 1994 six campaign for, who ran then? Clinton and
Gore.
Clinton Gore.
New York State.
And you won by a huge plurality.
It was a happy year.
Yeah. So we got two experts here to talk about the issue, and the reason that Beth is an expert is one of the things she teaches at New York Law School is effectively politics and the net. So she's very much into, that's true, isn't it? Into the net. Now, the question I want to start off with you is, there was a most interesting meeting following the election up at Harvard in which the net guy for the Democrats, whose name is Zach Exley, who's probably 5 years younger than you, if that's possible, and the net guy for the Republicans, Chuck DeFeo, got up and spoke about, you know, how they ran their campaigns on the net and evaluated how they did. And the Democratic gentleman, whose name is Zach Exley, he got up and said, cool software doesn't win elections, and we didn't do very well. Is that correct representation of what you heard up there since you were there?
Well, I think that that is definitely a correct representation of what he said, and he definitely fell on his sword quite a bit for what he saw as a mistaken strategy in terms of the technology in the campaign. I think we have to be fair and say that Bush, while he won, and he won by a margin, he won by one of the narrowest margins of any incumbent Republican ever. Nonetheless, I think we can make an argument that the Republicans did do a better job of using the net and using new technology, I think to everybody's great surprise. The Democrats, traditionally allied with often progressive technology causes, who relied on open source technology in terms of the back end, in terms of the actual programs they were using, very much open source oriented, but not open source from the front end. That is to say, they were not engaging people in engaging each other, in using collaborative methods, in really taking a grassroots approach, when instead taking a very much top-down approach. They were terrified, I think, of the Bush money-making machine, and wanted to use the net primarily to mobilize campaign contributions and get as many people on an email list as they could, with the thought being that that would translate into votes. That is in distinction to the Bush strategy, where they did have many more email, they had longer email lists that they've been building up since 2000, about 6 million people on their email lists, versus the Democrats, who'd gotten about 4 million email addresses for the DNC. Kerry had maybe 2 or 3 million. People. But what Bush did differently, and that was tremendously interesting and tremendously strategic, was what they sort of termed Tupperware parties for Bush. Instead of simply...
Let me just stop for a second, because you're right on the main point, but I wondered if you would take the Tupperware party thought and just go back a little bit to what a lot of people of your ilk, who are familiar with what's going on in the net and politics, know about, but which the audience may not, and which I find interesting. And that is this idea of meetup.com. We did a program with Scott Hefferman, always mispronounce his name, during the campaign, in which we asked the question to this gentleman who started Meetup, and you tell us how Meetup works. Is Kerry going to be able to use Meetup? I mean, it was a prescient sort of program, but for the audience, Meetup, I mean, it fits right into the Tupperware party, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, what I think we learned from the campaign and particularly from the Republicans' use of the net is that the killer application is still face-to-face. It's not necessarily the internet. And what the internet is very good at, as Scott Heiferman in Meetup has shown, and as the Bush campaign has proven, is you get people to talk to their neighbors, to talk to other people in their communities, to talk to one another, and to engage in collaborative, cooperative conversations that then help get people mobilized within their own geographic communities.
Okay, so I want to come back to you. But I think for your experience and mine in the campaign and many of the audience, we were introduced to Meetup, though we didn't know we were being introduced to Meetup, through Howard Dean. I mean, Howard Dean really used the Meetup concept, whereby he would get the technology going and the names up on the net, but you didn't meet each other in net, you met in a home, and that was the basis of a grassroots movement. Now, you've been in politics a long time. Your wife, as I recall, went out to Ohio, not with Meetup, but with...
I went out to Ohio.
You went?
For 5 days
at
the end.
Let me hear from the voice of experience.
Well, first I want to say I do agree with Beth. It was not a huge margin. It was 62 million to 59 million. 3 million almost on the head.
Right. Was it 3 million? I thought it was 3
so that Kerry got roughly 9 million votes more than Gore. Rather substantial.
Right.
But Bush got 12 million votes more than he had in 2000. And I'm interested at Beth's report as to how they went about doing it. My own experience with this is I was actually in the campaign for General Clark in '03 and was very familiar with the meetups, which were enormously helpful.
You were?
And yes. And
did you go to? I mean,
yes. Well, my wife went to more, but I went to occasional events.
You actually went to some meetups?
Yes.
You mean you went to a strange bar, met strange people, or for Clark?
Gatherings of the Clark people.
And Tupperware, and you use Tupperware.
Well, Tupperware is.
I never thought you were that kind.
No. I don't want to say that Tupperware.
You don't strike me as a meetup type of guy.
I don't want to say that there was not Tupperware, but my wife took a very active role, and I would accompany her.
Right.
Now, it is. I do agree that face-to-face is the key, and it isn't just the number of names you have on your list. And it is interesting as you compare Bush versus Kerry. The Democratic campaign, and I received a lot of this stuff on my screen, was principally focused on fundraising, and it is unfortunate. But as you evaluate the comparative uses of the new technology, you have to look at the 527s as well. Yes. The 527s used meetups very effectively.
527s used meetups?
Yes, and my wife, who ran the New York office of ACT.
Okay, what's a 527?
527 is a group that is political, but must they raise issues.
Yeah. MoveOn.org.
MoveOn is a.
So your wife was like, you were.
That's a separate one, and there were lots of them. There was.
Well, it is an example, though.
Yeah, it is an example, and they are not governed by the campaign finance.
Right. So 527.
And they must operate independently of the campaign, so that and they were very effective.
Yeah.
And if I'd have to say, if there was a difference in this campaign, is that the Bush efforts were able to use the technology effectively locally in their key areas, and the Democratic efforts, including the 527s broadly defined, were very effective at getting people from out of state, where they were from blue states, to go into red states, much more than the Bush people did. How effective people can be from out of state campaigning in a different state is open to question.
Right.
Obviously, the best measure is a neighborhood Tupperware party where you're speaking to your neighbors and you say, here in our community we need candidate X. But out-of-state people can have a significant impact. But
well, that raises another point with respect to the use of the internet by the campaigns. DeFeo, he's the Republican who was speaking at this conference, which you attended, said that he did a very good job, he thought, of taking the zip code, or maybe this was in the materials, taking the zip code and you punch it in as a Republican in the zip code, and up on your computer comes all the people whom you should meet within your block, and tells you about them so you can go persuade them. And as compared to what Victor described, where New Yorkers may be knocking on Ohio people's doors, you're sitting in Sandusky, Ohio, and you've got 6 people that you go on the knock on the door on. And there's some feeling that was a lot more effective than the Democrats.
Well, this taught us actually something interesting about technology and about where we might be moving in terms of effective uses of technology, not only in campaigning, but in politics and in civic organizing and activism generally, which is the ability to use tools to create a community and to see who's in your community and to connect with people in your community. It's why we're talking about Meetup and why we think of it as something so revolutionary, and yet what it's really about is just reintroducing neighbors to each other. So they were very strategic in the Bush campaign, not only in terms of their internet strategy, but in terms of a rhetoric of enlisting people essentially in a war, making them part of a team, making them part of a movement and a community to win this election. And it fed into a rhetoric about the war on terror and sort of post 9/11 fears to say, come be part of something. And you can see your neighbors, you can find them, you can actually see them online, you can see pictures of their version of the meetup, essentially the house parties for Bush that they did. But there were similar uses of technology also from other groups. There's a group here in New York called the I-Beam Gallery that made a fantastic site called Fundrace. I don't know if you're familiar with Fundrace, but it let you look up by building, by street, by zip code, who gave what money to which campaign.
We got a lot of stories in the paper about that.
Yes, and let you visually see who your neighbors are. It was less about connecting with them, but it did let you kind of see the community visually. Move On did something similar after the Michael Moore, they did some Michael Moore video conferences, sort of online conferences with him after the 9/11 movie, and they let you see who else was online, who was getting involved, who was getting active. So it was a great way to connect people with each other. But the Bush campaign actually just did this much more effectively and much more widespread by connecting people to places and communities where they already had connections.
Well, listen, let me just ask you, I know you want to respond to that, but look, you're a longtime Democrat. Now what Beth is saying is, number one, the technology was better. Number two, the use of the technology was better. And number three, what she didn't say was that the DNC's technology was sucked, according to some people. Now, as a Democrat, I know this was a close election in your terms, but you didn't win. Don't you sit there saying, oh, for God's sake, how can it be that we were taken to the cleaners? We'll see if that's so. We lost at least this part of the battle when it's so easy to win it. How did that happen? Who do we blame? Who do we shout at?
Well, I'm not into the blame game, and I don't think that this was decisive. I have to say, what's remarkable about this campaign is how similar it was to the 2000 campaign. And after all, look at the number of states that switched. You could almost call it at the beginning that Kerry would take New Hampshire, and what did Bush take that Gore didn't? New Mexico and Iowa. So what is startling about the campaign was the lack of change. And it's true that, you know, the mistakes were made on both sides, and did the Democrats use the new technology as well as the Republicans? I don't know. I don't think the technology is there for both of them. I kind of think the Democrats didn't use it very well.
Well, doesn't that make you a little angry? I mean, I know you want to have something else to say.
I do, because I do want to respond to this fundraise.
But let me just come to one more point on this, because in the Democratic Party, there is presently a race for the person who's going to be the head of the Democratic Party, okay? Now, one of the candidates is Howard Dean. Now, why shouldn't every good Democrat, and I want to ask if you are, be behind Howard Dean after listening to what Beth said, which she says the Dems screwed up on technology, and here we have the technology king. He's the cutting edge. Why shouldn't we be for him?
Well, I don't think, A, he did his own technology. He was the beneficiary of the technology, and I think by the time this program is aired, where the choice will be made, it's going to be the DNC is going to choose the new leader in mid-February. My own view, since I don't have any particular.
Oh yes, you do too, Victor.
I know the answer is I don't, but I think it would be a mistake to go with Governor Dean.
But he's got all the technology.
He doesn't have all the technology.
Oh, okay.
He had some good technological people working in his campaign, and I hope the Democratic Party will take advantage of those skills, but they aren't with any particular candidates. The candidates don't do this. This is obviously people with special skills, and I hope they'll appreciate it. He may symbolize it, that's the most you can say, and I don't think it should be a relevant part of that choice. I do want to come back to the fundraise. I think a more important part of the choice is the signal the spokesman, the leader, should give for where the party and where it's heading, and their commitment to address the parts of the nation in which we did poorly. And I think that's the more important point on that. But I want to go back to the fundraise because I'm familiar with this site as well, and it has some very interesting consequences. It not only can bring people together, and that's healthy. That is the ability to check who to determine.
Yeah, the net is doing this, right?
Right.
Yeah,
who on
your age,
I live on my block, a building of several many apartment houses, who has given to which candidate. And the reaction of people is surprising. How can somebody live in our neighborhood and give to X? You know, and people who give, all of a sudden, they know their names are going to be filed, and they're going to be public, and if they give enough, maybe they'll be in some newspaper article, and maybe the candidates will look at it, and the lobbyists will look at it, but the notion that their neighbors are going to look at it, that's a new notion. Right. I have a little concern that it may discourage giving, which would be unfortunate. Maybe it will encourage giving, and that people will come together and find like-minded people, but it's one of the many areas in which the new technology does raise privacy concerns.
Well, now, look, I don't want to insult Victor Kovner because he's a guest of many appearances on this show. And I don't want to categorize you in any way, but it seems to me, just sitting here listening to the two of you, is it fair to say that perhaps there's a generational gap? And I would just wonder what your response would be. You can say what you wish thereafter, but isn't Howard Dean clearly the candidate of the digital age? And the other candidates are analog types and don't get it? And shouldn't we go where the action is? I mean, how are the Democrats... Here's a serious question. How are the Democrats going to get themselves out of this technological glitch?
Well, I think Victor's right, though. It's not, the technology is not owned by any one candidate. And in fact, and here's where I'm going to contradict your generational, perhaps, stereotype that you have. I'm going to tell you that it's not actually about the technology. And that's what Dean showed us. And that's what some of the Republican uses of technology showed us, is that it's about the process. It's about the method. It's about backing away from top-down, centralizing efforts to control, of which both parties are guilty. And I think that even though we can say that the Bush campaign and some of the Republican 527s used more, let's say, peer-to-peer or collaborative or neighbor-to-neighbor strategies, that in essence it's as much, the technology they use is as much what I would term brochureware. In other words, just advertising for the candidate, not actually engaging people in any way, not engaging them, really seeking their ideas or looking for their participation. So what Dean did differently in the beginning was he had a weblog. Kerry had a weblog too, but Dean's weblog allowed people to post and to comment and to participate. Dean got people activated and engaged in their own communities, doing things, participating, sought their opinions. And didn't work for him, and there for a variety of reasons, but I think it doesn't mean that he necessarily has to be the candidate of choice to head the party, but the methods that he adopted are the thing that we should learn from. And anyone can create the technology to do it. It's a matter of adopting and believing and buying into a new strategy, which technology, in the direction in which technology should be pushing us, which is this more collaborative, more engaged, more participatory approaches to building a movement, not simply the top-down, centralizing, the party must control everything approach.
Okay, well, let's I want to come back to this, you know, what the significance of what we've been talking about fits in the total mix. But Victor, let me see if I can get you off the idea that it was a close election and back to the idea that the margin was a surprise, and get your views. You know, what what happened? How all of a sudden the Republicans, when there's a big turnout, usually a big turnout means Democrats win. What was it that did it for Bush? Why did Bush win is the question.
A lot of people are looking at that, and I don't have any ready answer for it. But I did, having spent a little time in Ohio, in northeastern Ohio, where Kerry carried, but I saw a lot of Bush presence, and I read the race centered on Ohio almost for the last 4 or 5 months, and I did, like everybody else, read the articles about what they were doing, and it was clear that Bush had more people on the ground for a year or two, you know, county committeemen, district committeemen, responsible for lining up people earlier. Not the end of the campaign is getting the vote out, and that's important, but that's not persuading people. People are persuaded long before that. Keep in mind that for the last couple of months, the polls were showing Bush by a couple of points. Kerry rallied after the debates and then slipped back again, and then the polls vary, but a lot of polls called it. It was, let me say, this was within the margin of error.
Zogby, though, had Ohio, okay? I mean, you really think that you were out there that Bush was ahead at one point in time by 160,000 in Ohio? Then I forget what was the final
last
mark?
official is on 118, although there's some fuss about that, but I think it's pretty close to 100.
But didn't that surprise you?
You know, he won it in 4 years earlier by 164. I was,
tough guy. Tough guy. There are no cracks in the Democrat veneer over here. Well, let me ask you this.
I was disappointed. Was I shocked?
I think you would.
No. But, you know, if you're going to run a liberal candidate from Massachusetts, you're going to do well in your areas, and you're going to have a hard time in areas that are not traditionally Democratic.
When those reports came out that turned out to be false, that Kerry had won, didn't you go home at about 5 or 6 o'clock, you know, happy as could be, thinking, well, this is just what I thought? No. The answer to that question is no.
The answer is we've been at it too long.
We've been at it too long.
It doesn't count.
All right, one last.
You open the back of the machine and look at the numbers.
Okay, I want to ask one last question. I want to keep Beth out of this. But with respect to the organization, your answer is, at least in part, Republicans had a better organization, probably in the country, but certainly in Ohio. That's what you just said, right? But isn't that organization driven by the ability to get people really through the net? I mean, that's how organizations are done today.
I'm not surprised. I didn't see their stuff. I'm not on their list, and I'm interested to hear Beth's report and others. I'm not surprised that they used it effectively. They're very skillful, and it would have been shocking if they didn't use it effectively. And I do agree that the Democratic National Committee, at least, you know, did what Beth described as brochure material, basically advertising material for fundraising, which is not a good use of the medium. It's you've got to involve people. We win if we win it at the grassroots level, and lessons will be learned. People are analyzing this. It's
well, I think
we're still early.
Okay, well, I think I got a point with you. I mean, you know, if it's organization, and if the organization is related somehow to the net, and they have the better, you know, blah, blah. Now, why do you think Bush won?
Why did Bush win? Well, the jury is still out on this, but in terms of, I know you're asking me really about how the technology also played a role.
No, I'm really just wondering.
But I think, I mean, you really just want to know?
Yeah, I just want to know what you think.
I think we all want to know. I think, you know, he's an incumbent president in the time of war, in a period of great insecurity, national and international insecurity. There's a lot of inchoate fear that people suffer from and worry about all over the country. I think that fear and the flames of that fear have been fed by an incessant barrage of hate-mongering and fear-mongering on the media, and particularly on talk radio, that has continued. We're talking about the internet, but there are other older media that play a very significant role. In determining the election. It was close, after all, in the end, and the country we see, and I think to our great surprise and dismay to some extent, is very divided. We worry about seeing our neighbors being on the other side of what we view as a political fence. But I think that fear and the complexity of the issues and the nuance of the issues after 9/11 in particular were driving forces in this election. And that's where the effective use of the technology in this case to mobilize people on a local level in their geographic communities, in regions, focusing on getting people talking neighbor to neighbor was extremely useful, and giving people, as the Bush campaign said it was doing, making them team leaders in a fight, in what they were sort of billing as essentially the fight for the campaign, but again, the rhetoric about the fight in the war against terror, the fight against the foes of, be it moral values, American values, or peace and freedom in the world. So they were getting people engaged in doing something by giving them the tools, by giving them the weapons in this fight, namely zip code finders to find your neighbors, lists to show who else in your neighborhood was actually registered as a Republican, prizes and rewards if you actually recruited more people. They had a point earning, a sort of frequent flyer kind of system for voters. So they used the technology effectively in the context of this larger rhetoric about fear, and they played, I think, very well into that. I think both campaigns, though, missed an opportunity. I think Victor's absolutely right to use the technology for what it's really best at, which is connecting people, using it in social ways to connect people in their communities. The Republicans did a slightly better job at that than the Democrats. But ultimately, was the internet decisive in the election?
Why don't we just I'll come back to that. Back to that. Let me ask him ask that question now. Her theory is fear. Well, we got other theories out there, Hispanics, women. If you add up all these fears, all these theories, and relate them to the impact that the internet had on this, how do you do it proportionally? What's important? How important is the issue about which we've been talking tonight in the mix of things? Important or not important?
Well, I'm not satisfied that the internet was dispositive. I think there was I'm less familiar with what the Republicans did. I would agree that there were lost opportunities. The Democrats, at least the party itself, as opposed to the 527s, did not use it as well as they could. I agree completely with Beth about the overriding issues of the campaigning against an incumbent in time of war, the threat of terror, the exploitation, the misleading of the public over and over, playing to their worst fears. And we did very well under all those circumstances. At the same time,
now, Victor, I have to tell you, we're coming to an end, so this is your chance to summarize.
So
I'll ask the question which you're asking again. Why did Bush win? Did Kerry lose it on the net? And your answer is?
I don't think he lost it on the net.
I don't think
a liberal, a very liberal senator who I greatly admire from the state of Massachusetts
can
win a national election, because there's too much of the country that does not relate well to that candidate, and you need a candidate who has a greater ability to relate to that population.
Thank you very much for coming by, Victor Kovner. I'm going to ask you the same question. Why did Bush win? 1, 2? Was it dispositive? How important was it? And you got a very short answer.
Very short. Let's say Kerry didn't lose it on the net, but he didn't win it on the net either. They could have done more. The net, I agree, was not the only thing here. It was one factor in a larger context, but the net is here to stay. It plays a central role in politics. It will continue to play a central role. And I think the lessons of campaign 2004 are going to inform future campaigns going forward, and we're going to see better uses of the net to engage people not only in the campaign, but throughout the year in the political system.
Beth Noveck.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming by. And thank you very much for coming by. And come by next week and learn more about the digital age. For the digital age, I am James Goodale. Good night.